For much of the 20th century, the United States was widely regarded as the world's manufacturing powerhouse. In 2001, it stood as the world's top manufacturing country, contributing nearly 28% of all goods produced globally. In contrast, China was still developing its industrial base at the time and produced only about 10% of global manufacturing output. But that same year, China joined the World Trade Organization. This decision opened China's doors to the global economy, and foreign companies started to invest and set up factories in China. This move changed the balance of power in manufacturing between the US and China. Until 2009, the United States remained slightly ahead of China in total manufacturing value added. However, from 2010 onward, China started to overtake the United States and soon became the world's largest manufacturing country. Today, when you flip over a product and see the label Made in China, it represents a major change in the world economy. Over the past 2 decades, China has become the center where most of the world's goods are produced. But the question is, does China still hold the crown as the global manufacturing powerhouse, or is America now staging a strong comeback? Let's start with the rise of China's manufacturing empire and how China became the world's factory. For most of its history, China was a deeply agricultural country. Its economy relied mainly on farming, and for centuries, the majority of its people lived in rural areas. During the early years of communist rule, after 1949, the government followed a centrally planned economic system. Under this system, the government controlled what factories produced, how much they produced, and where goods were sent. There was little room for private businesses or competition. This rigid system slowed innovation and productivity. By the 1970s, China remained poor and isolated from the global economy. Things began to change in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping came to power. Deng realized that China couldn't progress if it stayed closed off. He introduced a series of bold reforms called Reform and Opening Up. For the first time, China allowed private businesses, foreign investment, and market competition. This paved the way for industrialization in China. However, Deng's reforms didn't instantly make China the world's top manufacturer. The early factories focused on low-cost, labor-intensive industries like textiles, toys, and electronics assembly. A major turning point came in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. This opened the global market to Chinese exports and removed many trade barriers. As international companies poured in, China built huge industrial zones, modern ports, and advanced highways and rail networks. The country became the center of the global supply chain. Millions of people moved from the countryside to booming cities. Within 2 decades, China had transformed from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower, known around the world as the factory of the world. China's manufacturing output has surged from about $134 billion in 1980 to nearly $4.9 trillion today. According to the United Nations, China now produces around 30% of all global manufacturing output, which is equal to approximately $4.9 trillion, almost double the US share of about 16% or $2.9 trillion. As China's manufacturing production expanded, so did its global trade footprint. Chinese goods began flooding markets worldwide. Many African countries that once relied mostly on buying goods from the United States and Europe have slowly shifted their trade toward China. In 2003, China was already the main trading partner for 18 African countries, about 35% of the continent. But over the next 20 years, China's presence in Africa grew rapidly through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. By 2023, this trade relationship had expanded so much that 52 out of 54 African nations, about 97% of the continent, now trade more with China than with the US. In the early stages of its rise, China relied heavily on its vast supply of cheap labor to become the factory of the world. Millions of workers powered low-cost manufacturing, producing clothing, toys, electronics, and other everyday goods at prices global competitors could not match. Historically, China's labor cost in manufacturing was very low relative to the US, sometimes only 3 to 5% of American rates, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Over time, China's wages have been rising, and some sources now estimate its manufacturing pay is about 20% of US levels. Even with this increase, the absolute cost in China remains much lower for many categories of manufacturing, which is why companies continue to offshore labor-intensive production to China. However, China's success was never only about cheap labor. Over time, it started moving up the value chain, producing more advanced, high-tech goods instead of just low-cost items. The government invested heavily in research, technology, and education, pushing Chinese companies to develop their own brands and innovations. This shift laid the foundation for China's next industrial revolution. In 2015, Beijing introduced two major programs, Industry 4.0 and Made in China 2025. The goal was to dominate the industries of the future, including semiconductors, robotics, aerospace, electric vehicles, and biotechnology. The plan aimed to reduce China's dependence on foreign technology and make its industries smarter through automation, AI, and digital manufacturing. Companies like Huawei, BYD, CATL, and Xiaomi became global names, leading innovation in electronics, batteries, and green technology. From steel and textiles to electric cars, drones, and solar panels, China now produces almost everything, and often at an unbelievable scale. Now, let's discuss the United States' decline from manufacturing powerhouse to deindustrialization. For much of the 20th century, the US was a global manufacturing giant, producing everything from cars and steel to electronics and household goods. But in the 1980s and 1990s, many American companies began moving their factories to other countries like China, Mexico, and nations in Southeast Asia. The main reason was cost. Wages were much lower, and businesses could also benefit from fewer regulations and lower taxes abroad. This made it cheaper to produce goods outside the US. Over time, this shift caused many factories in American cities to shut down, leaving behind empty plants and job losses, a process known as deindustrialization. By 2001, the US still held a dominant position, producing about 28% of all manufactured goods in the world. Recognizing the loss of industrial capacity as a strategic and economic risk, US leaders have launched a series of initiatives aiming to bring manufacturing back home. The CHIPS and Science Act, 2022, was made to provide tens of billions of dollars in incentives, tax credits, and research funding to boost domestic semiconductor production. The Inflation Reduction Act adds further support by offering tax credits and incentives for clean energy, electric vehicles, batteries, and other advanced manufacturing. In addition, Made in America and Buy American policies strengthen domestic demand by requiring federal projects to prioritize US-made goods, steel, and components. More recently, acts like the Made in America Manufacturing Finance Act of 2025 increase loan limits for small manufacturers. All these measures represent the United States' efforts to boost and strengthen domestic manufacturing. Additionally, the US is not trying to return to the old mass production jobs of the mid-20th century. Instead, it's chasing high-tech, precision, clean, and smart manufacturing. Companies like Intel, TSMC, and Samsung are building or planning new fabrication plants in the US. For instance, TSMC announced a multi-billion-dollar expansion in Arizona under CHIPS incentives. Similarly, companies like Tesla and Ford are expanding US EV plants. So, the US push is toward Industry 4.0, automation, Internet of Things, AI, and smarter factories. For many years, China's biggest manufacturing advantage was cheap labor. Factories in China could hire workers for very low wages, which allowed them to produce goods at a lower cost than in many other countries. But that advantage is shrinking fast. In 2010, many Chinese factory workers earned less than $2 an hour. Over the years, wages in China have tripled, or more, depending on the region and job. In some places, line workers now earn $4 to $9 per hour or more, especially in more developed provinces. At the same time, in the US, factory workers are paid much more. The federally mandated minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 per hour, although it varies from state to state. For example, as of January 1, 2025, Washington, D.C. has the highest minimum wage at $17.50 per hour. This means worker pay in America is generally much higher than in China. U.S. factories often use robots, machines, and AI systems to boost output. Because of this, a single worker in a high-tech American plant can produce 5 to 6 times more value than a worker in a traditional factory elsewhere. For example, US workers produce $83 worth of goods and services in just 1 hour. In comparison, a worker in China produces about $17 in the same amount of time. That's more than 6 times higher productivity per hour in the US than in China. Even though both countries are pushing for more independence, their economies remain closely tied through trade. The US continues to import a huge range of goods and components from China, from everyday electronics to critical technologies like solar panels. This reliance shows up clearly in the trade numbers. In 2024, the US trade deficit with China stood at about $295 billion, and over the past 5 years, it added up to nearly $1.6 trillion. China also depends on the US for advanced technology, especially high-end chips, software, and industrial machinery. When the US imposes tariffs or export bans, it hurts Chinese manufacturers. But when China restricts exports of rare earth minerals, used in chips and electric vehicles, it affects US industries too. This shows how deeply the world's two biggest economies are linked through production networks. The recent Trump Liberation Day tariffs once again reignited the US-China trade war. The new policy placed heavy tariffs on nearly all Chinese imports, aiming to pressure Beijing into new trade terms and protect American industries. In response, China retaliated with its own tariffs on US goods such as agricultural products, machinery, and electronics. Neither China nor the US has a smooth path ahead. China's manufacturing faces rising labor costs, an aging population, and weaker global demand. The country is also dealing with trade restrictions and an economic slowdown. Meanwhile, US manufacturers face challenges like high costs, worker shortages, and heavy dependence on imports for key materials. Both sides are investing heavily in AI, robotics, and clean energy manufacturing, because whoever wins this technological race will control the future of global production. So, who holds the crown as the world's manufacturing king today? If we talk about scale, production capacity, and exports, China clearly holds the crown. But if we talk about innovation, advanced manufacturing, and productivity, the US remains unmatched. China is the world's largest manufacturer. The US is the world's most advanced manufacturer. One builds the world's products. The other builds the technology that defines the future. So, the race between America and China is not just about factories or exports. It's about who will lead the next industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution was built in Britain. The second was led by America. The third, mass production, was mastered by China. Now the fourth revolution, driven by AI, automation, and green energy, is just beginning. And in this new age, the true manufacturing king will not be the one who produces the most, but the one who produces the smartest, the fastest, and the cleanest.